Good evening, everybody. To my great major inconvenience, I have to make a very quick trip to the United States just for Shabbos, and Mitzvah Shem, I will be back before next week's shir. So I hope there will not be any cancellations. So today, the Parsha, this of course is Parsha's Toldos, and the Haftorah we have, the past 2 weeks. We've had narrative Haftorahs. We've had stories. We had the story of Elisha and the child that he revived from the dead. And then last week we read about the Godfather-like struggles for succession in the aftermath of David HaMelech's death and what David HaMelech did before he died to ensure a smooth succession. This week, however, we no longer have prose. We're more into the issue of poetry and Musar. And the prophet that we have is the prophet Malachi. And of course, Malachi itself is a word that has a very specific meaning. It means my messenger, Malachi, but this was the name of this prophet. And what is significant about Malachi in particular is he is considered to be the last prophet of Israel. We know that prophecy died at the very beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash. And that is the end of the biblical period. The end of the biblical period essentially are the beginning years of the Second Temple, because shortly thereafter we have the Greek, Alexander of Macedonia, conquering the Persian Empire and taking over Eretz Israel, and that inaugurates the period after the Tanakh, eventually leading to the Tanoim and the Mishnah, of course, hundreds of years later. So the last 3 prophets of Am Yisrael are said to be Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And Malachi is the last of those 2, because Haggai and Zechariah are primarily concerned with in exciting the people to rebuild the Second Temple. Malachi, there's already a second Beis HaMikdash. Now it's interesting, Chazal have a tendency that they like to identify a number of different names as being the same person. You often find this tendency. And indeed, Malachi is given an alternative identity, and that's none other than the great Ezra. Right? We know Ezra. Ezra was the spiritual architect of the Jewish community at the beginning of the Second Temple period. Now, Ezra actually came to Eretz Israel after the Chanukat Bayit Sheni. He was not there for the Chanukat Bayit Sheni, but according to Chazal, Malachi is another name of Ezra. And when Ezra is functioning as the Zaken, the Chacham, the Gadol Hador, he is called Ezra. And when he is functioning in prophetic mode, he has a different identity, and that is Malachi. It's fascinating to understand that spiritual leadership, in fact, has these 2 different identities. The prophet and the Gadol are not necessarily the same thing, and in fact, they don't behave even in the same capacity. Just to give you one simple example, in the area of Psak Halacha. So we're actually told that prophecy does not have a role in Psak Halacha. Ein hanavi rishoi l'chadesh davar. A navi cannot be machriya. A navi cannot resolve halachic disputes by virtue of divine inspiration. That is based on the pasuk in the Torah, Lo b'shamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven. So the Chacham must function within the parameters of interpretation of Torah Shebaal Peh and those various rules. The Navi, however, is a conduit for inspiration, for chizuk, for general messages from God, and for specific things that need to be done that are outside of the Miskeret, outside of the framework of halacha. So whether it's Ezra, Malachi, the Haftorah of Parsha Toldos is from the book of Malachi. In fact, the beginning of the book. Now, why is Malachi chosen for the Haftorah? Because once again, just as last week, we were discussing the issue of succession as between Yitzchak and Yishmael, this issue now gets replicated in the next generation, in which Parsha Toldos involves the election, the choice of Yaakov over Esau, and I will actually discuss the very great difficulties of that choice, because unlike Abraham's choice of Yitzchak over Yishmael, which was done without fraud, without deception, there was full disclosure on all sides, and Abraham made his decision, at least after the prompting of his wife and God telling him to listen to his wife. The whole story of Yitzchak and Yaakov and Esau is a story that raises some very, very serious moral concerns. the issue of deception, the issue of lack of communication between husband and wife, and I'll at least briefly touch upon that. In fact, it's been well said that one of the proofs, it's a bit of a joke, but I think there's more than the kernel of truth in it. People say, how do you know the Torah is from God? Maybe it was just the Jewish people writing their own story. So one of the non-academic proofs of Torah min hashamayim is, if we were writing our own story, we certainly would not include all of these negative aspects. We make ourselves look quite bad with the story that the Torah gives, and as a result, that means it comes from God. It is not really the product of a human hand, unless it would be an anti-Semitic human hand, which I don't think anybody posits that as a direct theory. Now, the connection to the Parsha, though, just to indicate the simple connection, is the very beginning. First of all, the pasuk begins, Masa Devar Hashem El Yisrael. The word Masa is a very interesting word for prophecy. The word Masa means a burden. Why would a prophecy be called a burden? And the explanation is that, once again, a prophet by definition would be a lover of Israel, and one who loves Israel does not want to give harsh messages of rebuke. If you love to give Musar, you're not a person who should give Musar. The only person who is really deserving and worthy of trying to elevate and correct others is one who loves them and really hates to have to take that type of position. So for the prophet to give denunciation and criticism is a great burden on him. It is not something he enjoys doing. It says in Pirkei Avot that one of the 48 ways that you acquire the Torah is to be ohev es atokachot, to love rebuke. Now in that context it means I love to accept criticism because it improves me. But too many people interpret it to mean I love to give rebuke, and that is not really appropriate. So on the most simple level, whenever you have prophecies of criticism, they are often called masa. It is burdensome. But the Rambam gives a more generic and general explanation. And he says, the nature of prophecy is a person gets a message from God. And it's as if there's a certain agitation within him until he delivers it. He cannot rest, he cannot sleep. He has to let it go. He has to release it. And until he releases it, it is like a great, great weight on his shoulder. Because the word of God that's communicated to the Navi has to be released. Okay, so we then get into the actual message. Now again, you have to remember the historical context. This is shortly after the Babylonian exile. The temple was destroyed. King Cyrus of Persia has allowed the Jewish people to come back. In truth, he gave them permission to even rebuild the second temple. But shortly after the foundation was laid, the construction ceased for 18 years. And that's when the Purim story happens. This is already after the Purim story. Eventually, the king who succeeded Achashverosh, which according to rabbinic tradition is none other than Darius II, who was the son of Achashverosh and Esther. So there's kind of an interesting sense of humor here that the Persian king who authorized the rebuilding of the second temple was halachically Jewish, although it's not clear how he self-identified. And a second temple is built, and Malachi / Ezra is now describing the fact that although you have a Beit HaMikdash, people are not serving God with enthusiasm. They're not passionate. They're not joyous in their service. Now part of it might be because the overall state of Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim is desolate, barren. The second temple itself, this is before Herod, is a very simple, almost ramshackle structure. In fact, it is recorded that at the dedication of the second temple, there were old people who still remembered the glories of Shlomo HaMelech's Beis HaMikdash. And while the younger folk were singing and dancing, the older folk were sobbing and weeping as they remembered the past glories and they saw what they had now. And the pasuk says, perhaps with some hyperbole, because how many older people were there that remembered it 70 years before, that the crying of the older folk drowned out the song and jubilation of the newer folk. And of course, we know too that prophecy is waning, right? This is the very end of prophecy. So, the truth of the matter is, even though you would think the Shivat Zion would be a very, very glorious experience, as it should be, in truth, people are filled with demoralization. They are filled with a sense of hopelessness, meaning, yeah, we got Geula. This is as good as it gets. Is this what it is? And again, the analogies to Aliyah today might be somewhat the same. Now, Baruch Hashem, today Aliyah is a much easier process, and of course, Eretz Yisrael is filled with most modern conveniences. You can get Ben and Jerry's, and you can get Skippy peanut butter. But I mean, I remember, actually I've only been here 7 years, living here permanently, but I remember what people would say 40, 50 years ago, and they would say, if you're making Aliyah, be sure to take toilet paper, and be sure to take, Skippy peanut butter or whatever it is, because the Israeli peanut butter had peanut shells in it, and, all sorts of things. 5 years for a telephone. These were the stories people used to tell. And if you go back further, I remember reading the memoirs of Golda Meir, her autobiography, and she talked about, coming from Milwaukee, Kiev to Milwaukee, and then to the kibbutzim in the 1920s, and she talked about sleeping in the mud for 5 months with unbearable mosquitoes and polluted water, and how they heroically, built a land. But you can understand that there's a great deal of demoralization. Remember, in the 70 years of Babylon, many Jews were relatively comfortable there. They were economically well established. The Babylonians, granted, they destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, but they were actually fairly benign rulers, meaning once you were in Galut, they let you do what you want, with a few exceptions once in a while. So, Malachi, in God's final prophecies, is addressing a very, very demoralized people, a people who on one hand have experienced a Shivat Zion, which is a wonderful thing. They've experienced a Binyan Beit HaMikdash. And yet, they don't feel there's anything special about it. They don't really see, is this what we yearned for? Is this our dreams? So the Navi is giving them Musar in the sense that dreams are not always what God gives you. Dreams are what you create from the raw materials that Hashem puts into your life. You make your dream in the sense that with your enthusiasm, with your passion, with your heart, with your love, with your devotion, you make something special. Meaning, it's not like you sit back and wait for God to entertain you by giving you all sorts of wonderful things. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives opportunities, and we then have to rise to the occasion and make those opportunities something very, very special. Now, the particular technique that Malachi uses is Malachi uses rhetorical questions. So, for example, let's look at the second verse as an example. Ahavti etchem amar Hashem. I love you. This is what Hashem says. Don't look at what you have as rejection or not caring. I love you. V'amartem. But then you say back, B'ma haftanu. How have you shown us love? You bring us back to a desolate, empty, devastated land, and you drop us in the middle of a swamp, and you give us permission to put up a ramshackle hut to bring sacrifices to you? How is that love? So the initial answer is, Halo ach Esav liYaakov, no Hashem. Behold, Esav was a brother of Yaakov, a twin brother. V'yohav es Yaakov. And I loved Yaakov, and I rejected Esav. So at the very beginning of your national creation, I chose you. You are that I love. And then it goes on, and it gives the specific tochacha. Now, I just want to backtrack a little bit because I want to connect it to the Parsha. This itself is the connection, really. It's kind of a bit of a linguistic connection that this pasuk says, I loved Yaakov and I hated Esau, and that is kind of what you experience in reading the Parsha. But let's go over the Parsha a little bit in that particular incident. First of all, there are two transactions that are going on, and it's often not very clear what the relationship between them is. When Yaakov and Esau were 15 years old, this is the chronology that our rabbis established, and this was at the time that Avraham Avinu died, we find that Yaakov engages in a transaction with a pot of lentils in which he purchases what is called the Bechorah, the right of the firstborn. Now, although Yaakov and Esau were twins, but Esau was in fact the older twin, came out a little earlier, with Yaakov holding on to his heel. And the Bechorah involves certain privileges. We'll explain what they are. And Yaakov didn't defraud. This was not fraud. We would not call this sheker, but Yaakov took advantage of Esau's vulnerability. Esau is very, very hungry, and Yaakov is making this delicious cholent, probably vegetarian cholent, and he basically says, "Give me the Bechorah, I'll give you the food." And Esau utters words which are really very indicative of his philosophy of life. Hine anochi holech lamut. Behold, I am going to die anyway. Lama zali b'chorah. Why do I need this birthright? And Chazal explain, Esau is not simply saying, if I don't eat, I'm going to die, like for example, I'm dying of hunger, but rather he's expressing a philosophy of life, that after I die, there's nothing beyond the physical world, meaning there's no soul, there's no olam haba, there's no techiyat hametim. So all of this concept of serving God for some future purpose, Esau says, I don't believe it. All I see is the here and now. All I see is immediate gratification, and therefore my philosophy is, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. Therefore take this spiritual heritage. Again, Chazal understands that the concept of Bechorah is not referring to inheritance rights, as it was later understood, but it's referring to a kind of spiritual leadership and succession in terms of being the conveyor of godliness to the family, like the Kohen, like the priesthood. And this was technically Esau's right. Esau despised it. Esau vayives, he despised it, and Yaakov acquired it. Now, we then don't hear anything about this till many, many, many years later when Yitzchak is close to death, although he did live actually much longer. And at that point, according to Rashi, and again the chronology is very intricate, but Yaakov and Esau are 63 years old. So this is 48 years after that incident. There's a second transaction where Yitzchak wants to give a bracha, which he thinks is his deathbed bracha, to Esau, and Rivka causes a deception whereby he gives it to Yaakov instead. Now, one thing that's not clear, it's not really clear what is the conceptual difference, what is the difference at stake between the Bechorah at 15 and the bracha and what's going on there. Now, a second problem is, number one, ends justifying the means. How can Yaakov engage in deception and sheker to get a bracha? Where's the morality of that? Number two, even without the morality of it, what is the efficacy of that? I mean, if Yitzchak intended to bless Esau, I mean, is this like a magic thing, like a ray gun? Whoever's in front of the ray gets the bracha? I mean, Yitzchak intends to bless Esau. The fact that the guy standing before him is somebody else is not going to give him the bracha. The one who gets the bracha is the one that is the intended recipient of the bracha. I mean, it's too much of a mechanical process to say, oh, you happen to be standing in front of my hands, therefore you get it. Right? So one is the morality, one is the efficacy. And then the third question, which may not be as difficult, is how could Yitzchak be fooled? How could Yitzchak realistically think that Esau was righteous? Now, with respect to the third question, there are a number of approaches. You know, Chazal say, the Chumash says, Yitzchak was blind. Now, Chazal say that why was Yitzchak blind? He was blinded from the tears that the angels shed during the binding of Yitzchak during the Akedas Yitzchak. And some Meforshim explain that this is a metaphor and a mashal to express the idea that Yitzchak's contact with the angels, the elevation of Yitzchak as a sacrifice to God, made him unsuitable to see the hypocrisy and duplicity of the world. Yitzchak lived in a different plane. We live in a world of hypocrisy. We live in a world of sheker. We live in a world where people will often have the appearance of righteousness and piety, when in fact that doesn't exist. Esau in some ways was a hypocrite, although he genuinely honored his father. But Esau would ask his father very, very religious questions, although they were halachically invalid. How do you take truma and maser from straw or water? And Yitzchak, according to this view, through what you might call his sacred naivete, really thought Esau was sincere, Esau was holy, and therefore, according to this, Yitzchak was fooled. But once again, he was fooled through the holiness of his not understanding the world of duplicity and dishonesty and appearances that are not true. Rivka, the mother, understood that world very, very well. She comes from a home in which there was cheating and deception, her own brother Lavan, etc., and therefore Rivka could see through things in a way that Yaakov could not. In a way that Yitzchak could not. So that's interpretation number one, that Yitzchak was a victim of sacred naivete. But there's a problem with that, because the text clearly indicates that Yitzchak knew that Esau was not the righteous son. Because when Yaakov stands before Yitzchak with the goat skins, the hairy arms, and Yitzchak feels the arms, and Yitzchak utters the very famous words, Hakol Kol Yaakov. Yitzchak is confused here. The voice is the voice of Yaakov, but the hands are the hands of Esau. So you know what Rashi says? Rashi says, because Yaakov and Esau were twins, their voices were actually very, very similar. So what does it mean the voice is the voice of Yaakov? Because Yaakov uses the name of God, and Esau doesn't use the name of God. And that gets Yitzchak worried and confused. In other words, Yitzchak already knows Yaakov was always Maskir Shem Shamayim. Esau not. So if Yitzchak is aware that Esau is not as righteous as Yaakov, why does Yitzchak want to give the bracha to Esau? And another indication that Yitzchak knows Esau has problems is that immediately before this incident of Yitzchak asking Esau to get him food, it mentions Esau marries a Canaanite woman. And this was a source of bitterness to Yitzchak and Rivka. Because Yitzchak remembers how determined Abraham was that they don't intermarry with the Canaanites. So these are two textual indications that Yitzchak did not think Esau was a righteous person, and yet he wanted to give him a bracha. So there's a mahalach, and I'm going to bring it back to the Haftorah. There is a mahalach that is suggested by a number of Meforshim, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the Malbim, the Nitziv. They all kind of say the same thing. That Yitzchak's calculation was not naive at all. Yitzchak's calculation was based on the following idea. Yitzchak did love Esau. One cannot deny this. He saw in Esau, number one, it was his son, and number two, he saw in Esau many, many talents. A talent for conquest, for proactivity, for initiative. Esau was not the person who would sit in the Beit HaMidrash and teach Torah. Esau was not the person that would devote his whole life to Avodas Hashem. But Esau had genuine talents in building a society. Yitzchak understands that Yaakov will be the successor to the heritage of Abraham in spreading godliness to the world. Yitzchak always understood that Yaakov would be the foundation of morality. And the bracha that Yitzchak wants to give Esau, if you look at the bracha that he wanted to give Esau, that he gave Yaakov, it's totally a bracha about the physical and the material. May God give you the dew of heaven. May nations serve you. May you subjugate all those who rise against you. Because Yitzchak understood that perhaps the way I will get a salvation for my wayward son is to create a division of labor similar to what existed between Yisachar and Zevulun later, right? Yisachar and Zevulun, two of the tribes. Yisachar was a tribe that devoted itself to Torah study, and Zevulun was devoted to commerce. And by Zevulun supporting Yisachar, Zevulun gets a share in all of the Torah of Yisachar. Yitzchak wanted to create a Yisachar-Zevulun partnership between Yaakov and Esau. Let Esau create a society in Eretz Israel. Let Esau build the roads, organize the government, create the different pockets of activity, create the military, and create the engineering infrastructure. And Yaakov will be free to sit in Kollel, to learn, to teach godliness. And Yitzchak's reasoning was that this would be good for Esau and it would be good for Yaakov. It would be good for Esau because it would give Esau an outlet for his creative talents, for his energy, for his being a man of action, a man of the field. And it would free Yaakov from all of those responsibilities that might be inimical, might be inconsistent with a spiritual destiny. Seen in this way, the decision that Yitzchak is making when his kids are 63 years old, they're not youngsters, might be a rectification of an earlier decision that went in the wrong way. When Yaakov and Esau were born, so the pasuk says, "Vayigdilu hana'arim," the young boys grew up, and Esau became a hunter and a man of the field, and Yaakov was a man of the tent, which is understood as studious and introspective. Rav Hirsch says a thought. Now, some people say it's disrespectful to the Abba, so I always have to emphasize that this is Rav Hirsch. This is not me talking, so blame Rav Hirsch. He says, you know the way people dress twins the same and sometimes raise twins the same? Vayigdalu hana'arim says, initially, Yitzchak and Rivka directed Yaakov and Esau on the same path. To use, a modern analogy, although it wasn't exactly what they did then, they put both of them in the Beis HaMedrash, and they said, both of you have to learn Torah the whole day. But that wasn't Esau's personality. Esau needed basketball. He needed to run around. He needed outlets for his boundless energy that could not be confined to a stender or a Beis HaMedrash.
ADD?
Huh? Could be. It could be. Rav Hirsch writes, if you try to make an Esau into a Yaakov, not only will you not get a Yaakov, but all of the good qualities of Esau himself are going to be distorted and misdirected in rebellion and the like. So in a sense, what Yitzchak is trying to do now is he's recognizing Esau's abilities. He's telling Esau, hey, you're a hunter? Go and hunt for me and thereby fulfill the mitzvah of honoring parents. And that's the prototype in which I'm no longer delegitimating your talents and your abilities. I'm embracing them. And I want them to also have a role in Avodas Hashem and in building a godly nation and in building Eretz Yisrael. You will be the Gashmias, you will be the material person. And Yaakov will be the spiritual leader. And together you will create a partnership and a society. So this sounds good. This is a fairly sophisticated division of labor. But Rivka understands. Too little, too late. Maybe this would have worked when they were 15 years old. In fact, it's an interesting point. Let me make another related point here. According to Chazal, why is Yaakov making lentils when he's 15? Because when Yaakov and Esau were 15, that is when Avraham Avinu died. And this is the food of a mourner. Yitzchak was making lentils to feed his father. Now, Chazal have a Masorah. Esau did not become a Rasha and deny God until that day. So it's very tempting to me to speculate that as long as Avram was alive, Esau felt accepted. You often have a situation where you have a rebellious child, a child who doesn't fit the model of the frum kid we want. And sometimes the parents can't deal with that. Because why isn't this kid doing the way we want him to be? And often, the adult in his life that gives the child unconditional love and acceptance is a grandparent. Right? A grandparent, because a grandparent is a bit more removed from the day-to-day tensions. Often a child can confide in a loving grandparent, even more so than a parent. So it's very tempting to me, although I don't have a direct makar for this, that the statement of Chazal that Esau became a Rasha that day is connected to the idea that within Avraham Avinu's relationship, Esau found acceptance. Within the relationship of Yitzchak and Rivka, Esau was regarded as the other one, a bit of a pariah, a bit of an uncontrollable kid. A kid who's just not doing anything right. And now, many years later, Yitzchak wants to rectify it by legitimating and accepting Esau's talents. Seen in this way, there actually is a tragic dimension. Yes, Esau became a Rasha, no question about it. But in some ways, we, meaning our ancestors, bear a certain responsibility for that. And Rav Hirsch goes on and says, going back to the other question of the morality, how could Yaakov do it? Rav Hirsch actually says, now this is a big, big chiddush, and it's not 100% supported from the text. He actually says that Yaakov really wants to be caught. Yaakov really doesn't want to deceive his father. First of all, as you remember, Yaakov protested to his mother. Yaakov said, "How dare I stand before my father and I deceive my father? I will only bring upon myself curses." And Rivka says, "The curse is on me, son, don't worry about it. I take full responsibility." But Rav Hirsch says, Yaakov keeps on giving himself away. Yaakov uses the name of God. Like, why does he do that? Was that just unconscious? I mean, he's giving himself away. So Rav Hirsch actually says, Yaakov wanted Yitzchak to know that this was Yaakov in the following way. Part of why Yitzchak wants to bless Esau with the blessings of Mazeh is he feels that, number one, this will free Yaakov to concentrate on his spiritual mission. But number two, he feels Yaakov is too fragile and vulnerable to be exposed to the tough world of action. Because the world of sheker and the world of duplicity and the world of hard bargaining will destroy the sensitive spiritual nature of Yaakov, as indeed Yitzchak himself understood that this was not a world for him. So Yaakov has to show Yitzchak, I am also capable of deception. I am capable of lying. I am capable of cheating. Not that that'll be my modality, but the fact that I'm capable of it means I understand it. And if I understand it, I'm not going to be victimized. And therefore, your fear. So it's two things. Number one, Esau can't get the bracha because he's not going to use his resources for Yaakov. And number two, giving the bracha to Yaakov will not destroy Yaakov, because Yaakov has the inner resources to be able to handle it. And indeed, in a much deeper level, the purpose of spiritual life is to transform and elevate the physical. To posit that the spiritual person should be removed from the building of a society is actually against the overall message of godliness, which is to take holiness and transform it into the physical. Right? So this was the great debate, and Rav Hirsch actually says that Yitzchak agreed to Rivka eventually. That's why he basically said the bracha does belong to Yaakov. But this explains the relationship between the birthright and the bracha. The birthright was the spiritual destiny. That was already, Yitzchak knew that belonged to Yaakov all the way back. The diyun at this point is Eretz Yisrael, the physical building up of a society. Who builds the roads, right? Who creates the hospitals? Who builds the universities, the professions, the military, the police, the fire department? Should that be a Yaakov responsibility or an Esau responsibility? Yitzchak wanted Esau to have all of that. And Rivka convinced Yitzchak eventually, through this whole ruse, that Yaakov needs it and Esau is not going to utilize it in a proper way. Now, it's one other point, though, that one needs to know. So the concept of Yaakov using sheker is a vehicle, it's a pedagogical, didactic vehicle to convey to Yitzchak that Yaakov is not like Yitzchak. Yitzchak is a man that is so elevated, so sanctified, so otherworldly, that Yitzchak cannot comprehend a world of deception, a world of fraud. And as a result, he views Yaakov the same way and says, Yaakov, politics is dirty. I want to get you out of it so you don't become tainted. You don't become destroyed. And Yaakov is conveying through this whole ruse, I know this game, Dad. I know how they play it. And because I know how they play it, it will have less power over me. It will not destroy me in the same way. Again, these are deep and complicated issues. But I want to point out another comment of the Medrash. I received an email from a Christian woman the other day, and it was a relative, indirectly through different. And she raised a question. She didn't understand. She likes to listen to the Bible on her drive to work on tape, and she wonders about how in the Old Testament, and I don't know if she was making a Christian point or not, that people who lie and cheat and they seem to come out ahead, and there's no problem with that. Yaakov gets the blessings and everything's fine. He becomes the father of the children of Israel, who are God's elect. And yet, this all came through fraud and deception. And nothing happens to Yaakov. So I just pointed out to her, based on Chazal, that let's examine the rest of Yaakov's life. Yaakov supposedly got this blessing from Yitzchak. How did the blessing play out? Well, first of all, in the immediate aftermath of the blessing, Yaakov has to flee for his life. He'll never see his mother again, and he thinks he'll never see his father again. All of his possessions were taken away from him. He shows up to Lavan's house. He works for a woman that he loves, Rachel, for 7 years. And what happens is, he is a victim of deception. He gets the wrong wife. He is victimized by fraud. Lavan then changes his terms of employment, victimized by fraud. His beloved son Yosef is sold, and Yaakov is given a story that a wild animal tore him apart. The Medrash points out that even if we assume that Yaakov's fraudulent behavior was justified based on a higher morality, and there is indeed a legitimate concept that sometimes truth needs to be sacrificed for a higher goal. We don't deny that. One can give you many cases. The Nazis are looking for a Jewish child. You lie, you lie. We understand that there may be moral reasons not to tell the truth. There may be moral reasons to hurt people. But the Medrash gives the following amazing insight, that just as there's a physical law, let's imagine I jump into a fire to save a child. Did I do the right thing? Yes. Does that immunize me from the consequence of being burnt? No. You don't get burnt when you jump into a fire because God is punishing you. It is a consequence. It is a normal phenomenon of nature that even if your action is justified, there will be a cost. Well, the same way, there's kind of automatic consequences in the physical laws of nature. There is kind of an automatic consequence in the spiritual laws that govern the universe. And that is, when you cause pain and suffering to another, that will come back to bite you in one way or the other. Just as the old saying, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. He who lives by sheker will be affected by sheker. The rest of Yaakov's life, except for the last 17 years where Baruch Hashem there was reconciliation, but the rest of Yaakov's life He is constantly victimized by fraud and deception. And the Torah is teaching you a very subtle message. Now, it doesn't automatically say Yaakov is a bad guy, because Yaakov is not a bad guy. Yaakov did what he did for a higher morality. But it reminds you that there's a moral cost. And in fact, the Gemara even says, this was not only a moral cost that Yaakov suffered, it's a moral cost that we suffer to this very day. When Esau discovers that the brachos were given to Yaakov, so the pasuk says, "Vayizak za'aka gedola umara." And you really have to feel for Esau. Esau emits a bitter, loud cry. Chazal point out that that identical expression only appears one other place in Tanakh, and that's in the story of Megillah Esther, when Haman proclaims that the Jews are going to be eradicated. Mordechai hears the news. Vayizak za'aka gedola umara. Says the Gemara in Megillah, because of the pain that Yaakov caused Esau, the descendant of Esau, Haman, from Amalek, which is Esau's grandson, causes the descendant of Yaakov that identical pain. So there is an important lesson here. You know, people ask the question in very general sense, do the ends justify the means? The short answer is sometimes, not always. To simply say no is not true. But the point is, though, maybe it's the wrong question to ask. Even when the ends justify the means, there is what philosophers call moral traces that will still affect you in a negative way. The overall morality of an endeavor does not mean that all of its negative elements are purged. There are negative elements that can drag you down. This is why, for example, without getting into too many specifics here, because I want to get back to connect it to the Haftorah. This is why, for example, Rav Kook would point out that zealousness against people who break the Torah, right? The idea of demonstration, the idea of criticizing, the idea of giving mussar, on one hand may be justified. But he talked about how it corrupts the soul because it introduces in the soul a certain negativity and a certain hatred that at some point is no longer emanating from divine imperatives, but it becomes an affliction of the soul because you've introduced into yourself a certain negativity and cynicism about others that goes well beyond the parameters of what was a mitzvah at the time. And that's why Rav Kook famously wrote in a beautiful, beautiful passage that it is the way of the wise to create light rather than attack darkness. It is the way of the wise and the righteous to build the positive rather than overly focus on the negative. Because when we focus on the negative, even when it's justifiable, we become tainted with a certain hatred and anger, which can destroy us and carry over in all sorts of other contexts as well. Again, very, very wise and very, very true words. And again, I think unfortunately in the various disputes and polarizations that exist in Israeli society, I think we see this playing out in different ways. Okay, so now let's swing back to that story. I needed to connect it to the Parsha because there's a lot that's going on here. God is making a point that don't think choosing Yaakov over Esau is simply a function of some arbitrary choice. I liked Yaakov more and I chose him. Rather, it's a question of character, midot, and goodness. God says, I make choices based on virtue. I make choices based on commitment. And on one hand, I've shown you my love, and of course going back to the Exodus and all of those different things. I've given you Eretz Yisrael. I've given you a Beit HaMikdash. It's not so fancy, not so glorious. But how can you not have enthusiasm and passion And the specific thing that Hashem talks about is, and again, we don't really know if this is intended to be a literal criticism, he talks about the fact that Kohanim would bring blemished animals as sacrifices. Because it wasn't important to them. In the language of the Pasuk, Shulchan Hashem Nivzahu. The table of God is despicable. It's not worthy. Why do I have to give Hashem the best? I'll save the good from I take my own table, and I will give God the inferior, the second rate. Because, why is this even important? And Hashem points out that you are even worse than the Goyim. Because the Goyim, to their own gods, to their own idolatry, they bring the best. And in fact, it's interesting that the Gemara itself derives certain halachas from here. It says that how can you bring a blemished animal to the altar of God? So the Talmud in Masechet Sukkah takes this pasuk and it derives a more general principle from it, not limited to sacrifices. And this is actually the Talmudic, or the biblical source for the Talmudic principle called Mitzvah Haba Ba'avera. What is Mitzvah Haba Ba'avera? A very important principle. That if I fulfill a mitzvah through the commission of a sin, not only do I have the sin, but I don't have the mitzvah.
Example?
Yeah, so the example is very clear. I steal a lulav and an esrog. I steal a pair of tefillin, and then I wear it. Now, you might argue, well, okay, I committed a sin of theft, and I have a mitzvah of tefillin, so maybe I'm equal, right? One to one, so at least I'm no worse. The answer is no. A mitzvah that is accomplished by the commission of a sin is not a meritorious act at all. It is a desecration of God's name. And this is called the mitzvah haba b'avera. And the Talmud actually derives it from God's condemnation of bringing a blemished offering to God. So metaphorically, the way we understand it is, what you're giving to God is something tainted and blemished. God does not want immorality to be the foundation of his service. God does not want any avera to be the basis of how you serve him. And now, in a way, there's a problem here because there's a counter principle sometimes that if the only way you can do a positive mitzvah is by transgressing a negative, you're actually given the green light to do the negative for the positive. So there seems to be two opposite principles here. One is, don't do a mitzvah through a sin, which is mitzvah haba ba'avera. The other principle is aseh, tocha, lo sasa. Okay, we don't have to get into the answer for that, but generally speaking, this is the rule called mitzvah haba b'avera. Right? Somebody is dishonest in business and gives his profits to charity, to tzedakah. Has he done a good thing? No. Is his tzedakah meritorious? Does it count in Shemayim? It does not, because it came through dishonesty, immorality, and the like. Now, with Yaakov, obviously, there's kind of almost a counter text, right? Because Yaakov, on one hand, got the brachas by dishonesty, but as they say, the way Rav Hirsch explained it, Yaakov wanted Yitzchak to discover the ruse, and there was a certain pedagogical point. In a way, it might very well be that the reason why the Haftorah is indicating you don't serve God through sin is maybe it's designed to be a counter text so you don't misinterpret what happened in the Parsha. Sometimes the Haftorah is telling you, don't be over literal in what the Parsha seems to be telling you by indicating you don't serve God through sin. And again, though, the idea basically is that Hashem says that if you look at Avodat Hashem as a burden, as something you just want to get rid of, then I will reject you as well, because you will be a burden to me. If you desire to love me, embrace me, and do your best, then I will embrace you. As much as you want to be close to Hashem is how much Hashem wants to be close to you. And that's really a very, very important message. It's been said that part of the problem that many Orthodox people have is that even if we're committed to halacha, we look at the Torah as 613 problems that we want to circumvent so we can get on with the real business of our lives. So, I got this problem, kosher, this, now. So I just want to arrange everything so I can do what I really want to do. When in reality, it's really the opposite. The 613 commandments should be what our life is fundamentally about, and then I got to do other things in order to do that. Now, the Haftorah ends with another discussion, which God says, on one hand, the Kohanim and the Leviim seem bored, disinterested. They treat the temple and Hashem's service as something inferior, something that doesn't matter. But then Hashem describes in some very beautiful verses what an identical servant of God is, because that's what a Kohen is. Torat emes haisa b'piyu. He's really recalling Aaron HaKohen. The Torah of truth was in his mouth. He only taught that which was true. Avlo lo nimsa b'svatav. There was no crookedness or perversion in his mouth. B'shalom uv'mishor halach iti. In peace and in uprightness, he walked with me. V'rabim heishiv me'avon. And many he turned away from sin. You may notice that with some frequency, this pasuk is often used on matzevos to describe a very, very righteous person. Not only for a Kohen, even for a non-Kohen, because it doesn't specifically mention Kohen in this pasuk, but this is one of the highest accolades. A person who lived with truth, and a person who lived in peace, and a person who was not necessarily a professional Baal Tshuva Mekarev. When it says he turned many away from sin, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was actively involved. But it means by the life he lived, people looked at him and they said, I want to be like him. He made the name of God beloved in the eyes of others. And I want to point out that it mentions both living in truth and living in peace. Now you understand that on some level, those are kind of opposites. Because truth means I'm uncompromising. I say it as it is. I tell it as it is. And I see things that are deviating from truth, and I will not be able to be quiet. The man of peace tends towards peshara, tends towards compromise, tends towards letting things slide. So there are people who by dint of their personality are more inclined towards peace. I'm not going to rock the boat. And then there are fiery temperaments that are inclined to advocate at least their version of the truth. This may not be true, but it's at least their version of the truth. What Hashem is saying is, a truly righteous person has to be both. And that's a big challenge. A person who tells it as it is, who communicates the truth, who doesn't compromise, doesn't water down, teaches Torah, does not kind of shy away from giving the teachings of Hashem because it's politically incorrect or it makes people uncomfortable. But does it in such a way in which there is peace. In other words, where people feel respected, they feel legitimated, they feel loved. That's quite a challenge. And it really is a challenge, because you will find people gravitating to one polarity or the other polarity without being able to combine both. I think I may have mentioned Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, the great Rav of Brisk. I'm sure there were many Gedolim since then who exemplified this, but Rav Chaim died in 1918, so it's quite a long time. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, like all the Briskers, you might call on some level a fanatic. I mean, he was absolutely strict, not compromising. He thought Zionists were apikoursim if you were. He thought secular schools were anathema, any type of secular education. He was absolutely strict, absolutely uncompromising. And he was the Rav in Brisk, And Brisk had many non-religious Jews, or many modern Jews, or many even religious Jews who were strongly Zionist. And there were people who were opening up secular schools, or at least schools that combined secular and Zionism. Rav Chaim was denouncing it and cutting off money. And yet, what's interesting is, it is recorded, everybody in Brisk loved him. They said they couldn't live with him. They'd say, "Oh, this Rabbi, I can't, I can't stand what he's doing to us." But somehow, in a way that's hard to put your finger on, as difficult as he was a thorn in their side, but they just loved him because they saw that he loved them and he saw that he cared about them. And even though he thought their ideas were totally wrong, and he never hesitated from telling them that, there was still a sense that he was ultimately a man of peace. This is a very, very difficult quality. But the greatest of the great managed to combine them. Rav Kook was that way as well, although some would argue he was too far in the area of peace, but that's not entirely true. Rav Kook denounced many things that needed to be denounced. But it was always in the spirit of, I fight the issue, but not the person. The person is not bad. Some of the actions and some of the thoughts and some of the philosophies need to be opposed. So this is the very important emphasis on emes and shalom. And then finally, the next pasuk is also a very famous pasuk that is also on the matzeva of Kohanim. Sometimes, Ki siftei Kohen yishmeru das. The lips of the true Kohen guard true knowledge. There was always the true knowledge of God on his lips. The Torah yavakshu mipiyu. And that is the person from whom you should seek Torah. Ki malach Hashem tzivakos hu. Because such a person, a human flesh and blood, is an angel of the Almighty. Now the word angel literally means an emissary of God. But we usually use angel to refer to the supernatural phenomena. So here the Talmud makes a very interesting observation, which is a pretty high standard, really. It says, seek Torah from his lips, because he is like an angel of God. So the Gemara says, if the Rebbe who teaches you Torah is like an angel of God, you should seek Torah from his lips. If he's not an angel of God, then don't seek Torah from his lips. Well, if you take it quite literally, we're all in big trouble. Except for the greatest of the great, we are not on the madrega of malachim. But the Rambam modifies it a little bit. It's still a high standard. The Rambam says this refers to midos tovos, that if you have, for example, a brilliant scholar, somebody who knows a tremendous amount of Torah, but the person has bad midos, the person is rude, the person is arrogant, the Rambam says you're not supposed to learn Torah from such a person. The Rebbe, the teacher, on some level is supposed to be an angel of God, meaning these are mitos tovos. So this is an important thing. When you consider, for example, you're looking for a teacher for your child, you're looking for a yeshiva, you're looking for a cheder, you're looking for any type of school setting and the like. And sometimes people look at the academics, how good is the learning, how good is the education. And people don't always pay attention to the mitos that are inculcated. But this says no. When you look for somebody that is supposed to be the vehicle to communicate Hashem's Torah, you have to look for teachers and by extension schools that represent the epitome of Malach Hashem Tzivakos. Right? This is the ideal Kohen, this is the ideal Levi, this is what it means to be a man of God, a person of God, a man or a woman of God. Somebody who makes the name of Hashem beloved. The Gemara says in Kriya Shema, V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha. You shall love Hashem your God. The Gemara's interpretation is, you shall make the name of God beloved in the eyes of others. Now I remember I once, somebody, many years ago, somebody was very, very critical of something I did. I don't even remember exactly what it was, but what I do remember is the mashal she gave me. And she knew Rav Simcha Wasserman. The great Rav Simcha Wasserman was the only surviving son of the great Rebbe Chanan Wasserman. And Rav Simcha Wasserman himself, he and his wife, they died without children. So there is literally no living descendants of Rebbe Chanan Wasserman in the world. In fact, it's fascinating. When he died, the only one who would sit shiva for him was his wife. And she said she really does not want to live without him. But such a great man needs one person to sit shiva for him. So she sat shiva for him, and I believe she died the day after shiva. She willed herself to stay alive for 7 days, and then she just went.
His other children died in the Holocaust?
Yes, children died in the Holocaust. There was one grandson from another son who survived, and he died of cancer before Rav Simcha. So Rav Simcha was the last son, last descendant of Rebbe Chanan, and when he died without children, there was no one left at all. But what she said was she knew Rav Simcha Wasserman. Rav Simcha Wasserman, on one hand, was a great Talmid Chacham, but on the other hand, he was very involved with Jews of very limited background. He could teach at the very highest, very highest levels, and yet he also taught at the very beginning levels. And she said that knowing Rav Simcha, she was convinced that if the whole Torah had been forgotten, she could reconstruct it by just watching the way he lived every day. That she could see in his life what a Jew is supposed to do and what a Jew is supposed to be. Because everything he did was only in accordance with Hashem's will. So she could, as it were, reconstruct the Torah from watching him. And she said that is what a true teacher of Torah is. And again, in Rav Simcha Wasserman's case, it was very true. Okay, so that's kind of the Haftorah of Malachi, and as they say, he is the very last prophet. So when you read his words, you have to look at it as a farewell message, just as Yaakov Avinu's blessings before he dies, and Moshe Rabbeinu's blessings before he dies. So Malachi, as the last prophet, is giving us messages from Hashem that we're not going to directly hear in this form until the restoration of prophecy with the coming of Mashiach. So you'll have a wonderful Shabbos. Mir Hashem, I very much hope to be here next week. If God forbid there's some problem,
we should call to verify before we come.
Yeah, in other words, if you don't hear from me, we're on. If you hear from me, then okay, I'll take
it.